The sun hung mercilessly overhead as Mason Carter knelt beside what he initially mistook for a rotting log. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of infection and decay. Then came the barely perceptible rise and fall that confirmed this mass was breathing. Mason leaned closer, his arthritic knees protesting against the gravel. What he saw made his stomach lurch. A German shepherd, once majestic, now reduced to a skeleton draped in fur, its body writhing, not from movement, but from thousands of ticks that created a living, pulsating second skin. The dog's eyes, though, those eyes, clouded with pain, yet holding a stubborn spark that Mason recognized all too well from his own reflection. The animal managed to lift its head just slightly, meeting Mason's gaze with unexpected clarity. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The ditch where the dog lay would flood within hours. Mason had to decide now. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Mason Carter's weathered hands trembled slightly as he spread an old quilt across the back seat of his pickup. 15 years a widower, the Vietnam veteran had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude. His two-story farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania stood as a monument to better days, when Martha's laughter echoed through the halls, and his children's footsteps thundered down the stairs. Now, at 68, his only regular visitors were the persistent aches in his joints and monthly calls from children too busy with their own lives to visit. The retirement check that arrived each month stretched thin between property taxes, heart medication, and the endless small repairs his aging home required. Mason had learned to get by with less, wearing the same flannel shirts until they frayed, eating simple meals, and putting off the doctor's visits his arthritis demanded. Pride kept him from asking his children for help. After 40 years in construction, a man ought to be able to take care of himself, he believed. Across town, Dr. Eleanor Sullivan was contemplating the for sale sign she'd placed in front of her veterinary clinic just last week. At 63, the demands of being the only vet within 30 miles had worn her down to bone-deep exhaustion. Since losing her husband to cancer 7 years ago, the clinic had become both her refuge and her prison. Rural clients who could barely afford care, mountains of paperwork, and equipment that needed replacing she couldn't afford. It was all becoming too much. Sheriff James Cooper was making his usual rounds, passing by Mason's property as he did each morning. The county budget cuts meant less deputies and more territory to cover. At 55, Cooper had seen the slow decline of their once thriving community as factories closed and young people left. His approach to law enforcement was straightforward. Follow the rules, keep the peace, and don't get too involved. The county animal control budget had been slashed again, meaning more strays, more complaints, and more difficult decisions about which situations warranted intervention. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Thomas Red Wilson sat on his porch, nursing a bottle despite the early hour. The construction accident that left him unable to work was just the beginning of his downfall. After losing his son in the house fire 8 years ago, Wilson had lost everything else too: his marriage, his home, and finally his capacity for kindness. The neighborhood children avoided his property, and even the mail carrier left packages at the edge of his overgrown lawn. Mason's pickup truck fishtailed on the slick road as the first fat raindrops splattered against the windshield. In the rearview mirror, he could see the bundle of quilt shifting slightly with each turn. The dog hadn't made a sound, not a whimper, not a growl, since Mason had gently lifted its broken body from the ditch. That silence worried him more than any noise would have. "Hang on there, fella," Mason muttered, wincing as he hit a pothole that sent pain shooting through his arthritic hands, gripping the steering wheel. Few more minutes. Dr. Sullivan's clinic appeared through the rain-streaked windshield, its Sullivan Veterinary Services sign flickering as lightning split the sky. Mason parked haphazardly near the entrance, the truck straddling two spaces, every movement deliberate and painful. He worked the door open against the strengthening wind and carefully gathered the quilt-wrapped bundle. The bell above the clinic door jangled as Mason shouldered his way inside, water streaming from his baseball cap. "We're closing early due to the storm," called a voice from behind the reception desk, where a young woman was packing up files. Her eyes widened as she took in the dripping man and the bundle in his arms. "Oh my, Dr. Sullivan! Emergency!" "Doctor?" Sullivan emerged from the back room, reading glasses perched on her nose, and fatigue etched in the lines around her eyes. At the sight of Mason standing there, soaked, and cradling something that dripped dark water onto her linoleum floor, she immediately motioned toward the examination room. "Janet, cancel my last appointment. Call the Thompsons and reschedule." Her professional demeanor took over as she held the door for Mason. "What have we got here?" The examination room's harsh fluorescent lighting revealed the full horror of the dog's condition, as Mason carefully laid the bundle on the stainless steel table. Dr. Sullivan's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock, as she methodically began to assess the animal. "Found him in a drainage ditch off County Road 8, Mason explained, his voice rough. "Never seen anything like it. Those things, they're all over him." Dr. Sullivan's gloved hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, examining the matted fur, and the seething mass of ticks that covered much of the dog's emaciated body. "Male German Shepherd, severely malnourished, dehydrated," she dictated, as if to an invisible assistant. "Extensive tick infestation, probable tick-borne illnesses, evidence of previous physical trauma, these older scars on the flank and muzzle." She looked up at Mason, her professional mask slipping just slightly. "This dog has been abused, Mr. Carter, and then abandoned to die." The examination continued in tense silence, broken only by the drumming of rain against the roof and Dr. Sullivan's clinical observations. Mason stood awkwardly in the corner, his wet clothes creating a puddle beneath him, his weathered face tight with concern. The clinic door jangled again, and Sheriff Cooper stomped in, shaking rain from his hat. "Eleanor, got your message about closing early. Thought I'd swing by to make sure—" He stopped short at the scene in the examination room. "What in God's name is that?" "That, Doctor," Sullivan said without looking up, "is a dog that someone tried to kill in about the cruelest way possible." Sheriff Cooper stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving to cover his nose. "Jesus Christ! I'm starting IV fluids and antibiotics, Doctor," Sullivan continued, sliding a needle into the dog's foreleg with practiced precision. "But, Mr. Carter, I need to be clear. This animal's prognosis is extremely poor. The treatment he needs will be extensive and expensive, with no guarantee of success." Mason shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the sheriff's presence. "How much are we talking?" The figure Dr. Sullivan quoted made Mason's heart sink. It represented nearly half of his remaining savings, money he'd been setting aside for the roof repairs his house desperately needed before winter. "The humane option might be euthanasia," Sheriff Cooper suggested, his tone gentle but practical. "County's overrun with strays as it is, and with the shelter at capacity." "He's not a stray anymore," Mason interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice, "and is not being put down. Not today." Dr. Sullivan and Sheriff Cooper exchanged glances. "Mason," Dr. Sullivan began carefully, "I understand how you feel, but this dog is suffering. The rehabilitation would take weeks, maybe months. The cost— I'm giving him 72 hours, Mason said, his jaw set in the stubborn expression his late wife had always called his mule face. If he wants to live, he'll show us. If not—" His voice trailed off. Thunder crashed overhead, making the lights flicker. In that moment of dimness, Mason could have sworn he saw the dog's eyes open, just briefly, seeking his own. 3 days, Mason repeated softly. That's all I'm asking. 3 days stretched into an agonizing vigil. Mason dozed in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside the treatment kennel, his arthritic hip protesting each time he shifted position. Dr. Sullivan had allowed him to stay after hours, recognizing the stubborn determination in the old veteran's eyes. The clinic's night lights cast long shadows across the room as monitors beeped softly, measuring out the precarious rhythm of the German Shepherd's life. 72 hours, Doctor, Sullivan announced, entering the treatment room with a clipboard. Her voice, though professional, carried an undercurrent of surprise. He's still with us, Mason. Mason straightened, wincing at the stiffness in his back. Told you he was a fighter. Dr. Sullivan checked the IV fluids and examined the dog's vital signs. The animal remained mostly motionless, but his chest rose and fell with greater strength than before. The painstaking process of removing thousands of ticks had left patches of raw skin that now glistened with antibiotic ointment. His skeletal frame remained terrifying to behold, but some indefinable change had occurred. The shadow of death that had hung so heavily around him had receded, if only slightly. "I'm going to test something," Dr. Sullivan said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small silver whistle and blew it softly. The sound was barely audible to Mason, but the dog's ear twitched unmistakably. "What was that about?" Mason asked. "Special frequency whistle," she explained, watching the dog carefully. "Used in military and police dog training." I had a hunch. She moved to the dog's head and gently lifted his lip, examining his teeth. "These canines have been filed slightly. It's a modification sometimes done for rescue dogs to prevent accidental injury when pulling victims to safety." Mason leaned closer, intrigued. "You think he was a working dog?" "More than that. Watch this." Dr. Sullivan stood at attention and firmly commanded, "Position!" The change was immediate and astonishing. Despite his weakened state, the dog's ears perked forward, and he made a valiant attempt to lift his head, his body responding to a deeply ingrained training command. "Well, I'll be damned," Mason whispered. "This is no ordinary stray, Mason. This dog has had professional training, expensive training. Someone invested thousands of hours in him." Dr. Sullivan's expression darkened, which makes his condition even more disturbing. The conversation was interrupted by Janet, the receptionist, poking her head in. "Dr. Sullivan, Sheriff Cooper is here." Sheriff Cooper entered, removing his hat respectfully as though entering the hospital room. "Heard our patient made it through the night. Tough old boy." He nodded toward the dog, then fixed his gaze on Mason. "You look like you've been rode hard and put away wet, Mason. When's the last time you went home?" Mason waved off the concern. "I'm fine right where I am." The sheriff and Dr. Sullivan exchanged knowing glances. Mason Carter's stubbornness was legendary in their small community. "Well, the dog's alive," Cooper acknowledged. "What happens now?" Dr. Sullivan hesitated. "Medically speaking, he's stable enough to be moved, but he needs around-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks. Specialized diet, medication schedule, wound treatment. The county shelter isn't equipped for that level of care." "I'll take him," Mason said without hesitation. "Mason," Dr. Sullivan began carefully, "this isn't like taking in a healthy dog. He needs medical supervision, and your house isn't set up for—" "I'll set it up," Mason interrupted. "My sunroom faces east. good morning lights, temperature controlled. I can put a bed in there, stay close by. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. Mason, I know you mean well, but have you thought this through? The cost alone. I've got savings. A savings you were going to use to fix that roof before winter hits, Cooper reminded him. Your children would have my hide if they knew I let you. My children don't get a say in how I spend my money, Mason said sharply. Then, more softly, Jim, I need to do this. Can't explain it, but I do. After a long silence, Dr. Sullivan sighed. If I write out detailed care instructions, provide the medications, and check in daily, it might work. She turned to Mason with a stern expression. But at the first sign his condition is deteriorating, he comes back here immediately. Agreed? Mason nodded, relief flooding his weathered features. By that afternoon, Mason's sunroom had been transformed. An old mattress lay on the floor beside a makeshift dog bed fashioned from blankets and pillows. The coffee table was covered with medications, gauze, and feeding supplies. Dr. Sullivan supervised as Mason carefully transported the dog from her clinic to his home. Have you thought of a name for him? She asked as they settled the still sedated animal onto his new bed. Mason hadn't. But as he watched the dog's response to the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows, a memory surfaced from his military days. Ranger, he said. He's got that look about him. The way he tried to position when you gave the command. Like a soldier. Ranger, Dr. Sullivan repeated, nodding. It suits him. That evening, Mason's neighbor, Sarah Bennett, appeared on his porch with a proper dog bed and a container of homemade soup. Heard about your new roommate, she said, peering curiously past him toward the sunroom. Thought you could use these. Word travels fast, Mason commented, accepting her offerings with awkward gratitude. Small town, Sarah shrugged. Besides, Janet from the vet clinic is my cousin. She hesitated. Is it true about how bad he was? Mason nodded grimly. Worst I've ever seen. The first night was challenging. Ranger whimpered in pain, despite the medication, and Mason found himself talking softly to the dog through the dark hours, telling stories of his construction days, of Martha, of the children when they were young. Somewhere in the early morning hours, he dozed off mid-sentence. He awoke to find Ranger's eyes open, watching him steadily. For the first time, Mason saw awareness in that gaze, recognition, assessment, and something that might have been the faintest glimmer of trust. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Michael, his oldest son, calling from Pittsburgh. Dad, Sarah Bennett called Lisa, who told her husband, who plays golf with my colleague Dennis, who thought I should know you've apparently adopted a dying dog. Mason rubbed his forehead. It's complicated, Michael. Dad, you can barely take care of yourself. Your heart, your arthritis. I'm managing just fine, Mason interrupted, feeling the familiar tension headache beginning. The dog needed help. I'm helping. And the cost? Sarah mentioned something about expensive treatments. My money, my choice, Mason said firmly. After hanging up, Mason noticed Ranger had managed to lift his head slightly, eyes still fixed on him. On impulse, Mason extended his hand, holding it steady several inches from the dog's muzzle. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with obvious effort, Ranger stretched his neck forward and sniffed Mason's fingertips. He didn't lick them or show affection. He was far too weak and wary for that. But he accepted the scent, cataloging it, perhaps filing it under not a threat. It was a small moment, but to Mason it felt monumental. As he prepared Ranger's morning medications, he found himself remembering the promise he'd made to Martha in her final days. Don't close yourself off, Mason, she had whispered, her hand frail in his. Your heart's too good to spend the rest of your life alone. Promise me you'll open it again someday." He'd made the promise to comfort her, never expecting to keep it. Yet here he was, 15 years later, his heart cautiously opening to a broken creature who needed him. Outside, Sheriff Cooper parked his cruiser and approached the house, a folder tucked under his arm and a troubled expression on his face. By the second week, a rhythm had established itself in Mason's sunlit home. Each morning began with medication, hidden in small portions of the special high-calorie food Dr. Sullivan had prescribed. Mason would sit cross-legged on the floor beside Ranger's bed, speaking in low, even tones while the dog cautiously consumed his breakfast. The previous week's wariness had given way to a tentative routine, with Ranger's eyes tracking Mason's movements throughout the day. "That's it. Take your time," Mason encouraged, as Ranger lapped water from a shallow bowl. The dog's frame remained skeletal, but the angry red patches where ticks had been removed were beginning to heal, and tufts of new fur sprouted in the bare spots. Dr. Sullivan had warned it would be months before his coat fully returned, if ever. Mason had taken to reading aloud from yesterday's newspaper while Ranger rested, the sound of his voice seeming to soothe the dog. Sometimes, when Mason thought Ranger had fallen asleep, he'd find those intelligent eyes watching him with an intensity that felt almost like communication. "You're looking better today," Mason observed, carefully applying ointment to a particularly slow-healing wound on Ranger's flank. The dog tensed, but allowed the treatment. Progress from the first days when any touch had elicited trembling. "Few more weeks, you might even be handsome again." Dr. Sullivan's daily visits had become a fixture in their schedule. She arrived each afternoon, medical bag in hand, her clinical assessments gradually giving way to something warmer as Ranger's condition improved. "His blood work is improving," she announced on day 14, reviewing the latest results. "Still anemic, but the tick-borne infections are responding to the antibiotics." She watched as Ranger accepted a gentle scratch behind the ears from Mason. "And he's clearly bonding with you." "Just getting used to me is all," Mason demurred, though he couldn't hide the pleasure in his voice. Dr. Sullivan sat at Mason's kitchen table, removing her reading glasses with a sigh. "I've been researching that tattoo we found inside his ear. It's partially obscured by scarring, but I'm fairly certain it's a service dog registration number. I've sent inquiries to several agencies." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense with how he responds to commands. Sheriff Cooper find anything?" "Not yet. He's checking missing dog reports from surrounding counties." She hesitated. "Mason, I need to talk to you about your health." Mason stiffened. "Nothing wrong with my health that concerns anyone but me. I'm a doctor, even if my patients usually have 4 legs. I can see you're in pain. You're favoring your left side. You've got shortness of breath when you bend over, and you've lost weight since this started." "Just busy taking care of him," Mason deflected. "You've missed your cardiology appointment. Sarah mentioned she saw the reminder card on your counter." Mason's expression hardened. "Small towns. Can't sneeze without everyone knowing." "Small towns look after their own," Dr. Sullivan corrected gently. "You need to see Dr. Phillips. Ranger is stable enough now that you can leave him for a few hours." Mason changed the subject, but the seed of concern had been planted. That night, after taking his own neglected heart medication, he sat beside Ranger's bed and admitted aloud what he hadn't wanted to acknowledge to Dr. Sullivan. "Truth is, boy, I'm scared to go. Last time they talked about procedures, specialists in Pittsburgh." He stroked Ranger's head softly. "Money I'm using to get you well, and I can't bring myself to regret that choice." Ranger lifted his head, and for the first time deliberately pressed his muzzle into Mason's palm. The following day brought a breakthrough. Mason had been researching rescue dog training online. Learning the standard commands, these specialized animals were taught. On impulse, he stood at attention and issued a clear command. "Ranger, stay!" The response was immediate. Despite his weakened state, Ranger's posture shifted subtly, his eyes focused intently on Mason, his body becoming still in a trained response that transcended his physical condition. "Good boy," Mason whispered, amazed. He tried another. "Ranger, come." The dog struggled to rise, his atrophied muscles trembling with the effort. Mason quickly knelt beside him. "No, boy, don't strain yourself. That's enough for today." But something had awakened in Ranger, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or a connection to his former training. Over the next few days, Mason carefully incorporated simple commands into their routine, watching in amazement as Ranger responded with increasing alertness. Online research became Mason's nightly routine. After Ranger fell asleep, he scoured websites about rescue dogs, learning about their training, their psychology, their extraordinary capabilities. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that Ranger had once been exceptional at his job. "Says here you fellas can detect a person under 6 feet of snow," Mason read aloud from an article. "Bet you were something to see in your prime." Financial reality intruded harshly as the first month drew to a close. Mason sat at his kitchen table surrounded by bills, the latest for Ranger's medications, his own prescriptions, the property taxes due next month, and an estimate for the roof repairs that couldn't be postponed much longer. His retirement savings had dwindled alarmingly. With reluctance, he began listing items for sale in the local paper. His collection of vintage fishing gear, tools he'd held onto from his construction days, even Martha's china that the children hadn't wanted. The decisions were painful, but when he looked at Ranger, now able to walk short distances around the sunroom, the sacrifice felt worthwhile. Word had spread throughout their small community about the tick dog, as people had taken to calling Ranger. Mason was surprised one Sunday to find Pastor Williams at his door. "The congregation took up a special collection," the pastor explained, handing Mason an envelope, "for Ranger's care." Mason's pride warred with necessity. "That's mighty kind, but it's not charity, Mason. It's community." The pastor smiled. "Besides, half the town wants to meet this miracle dog when he's feeling better." Similar gestures followed. Sarah brought home-cooked meals for both you boys. The local pet store donated a proper dog bed and supplies. The butcher saved marrow bones that Mason could boil for strengthening broth. Each offering eased Mason's financial burden slightly, while knitting him back into the community he'd withdrawn from after Martha's death. Sheriff Cooper's visits became regular as well, though they took on a more official tone after his third week of investigation. "Found something interesting," he announced, spreading documents on Mason's kitchen table. "Ranger's service tattoo matches records from Mid-Atlantic Rescue Service. He was quite the hero, certified for both disaster response and search and rescue. Worked several major incidents, including the Westbrook mine collapse 4 years ago. Saved 9 lives during his career." Mason absorbed this information with a mix of pride and confusion. "So what happened? How does a decorated rescue dog end up half dead in a drainage ditch?" Cooper's expression tightened. "That's the troubling part. According to their records, he was adopted out to a private owner 3 years ago, after a leg injury limited his field work. Perfectly normal procedure. But the adoption records are incomplete. Missing address information. Inconsistent follow-ups. Someone falsified records? Can't say for certain, but something doesn't add up." Cooper gathered his papers. "I'm still digging." As Ranger's physical recovery progressed, the psychological scars became more apparent. The first thunderstorm after his arrival sent him into trembling panic, wedging himself behind the sunroom sofa despite his weakness. Mason sat on the floor nearby, talking softly until the storm passed. Certain movements, a hand raised too quickly, the sound of glass breaking when Mason dropped a mug, would trigger a cowering response that broke Mason's heart. Yet each day brought small improvements. Ranger began to seek out Mason's company, following him from room to room for short periods before tiring. By week 5, Ranger had gained enough strength to venture into the backyard for brief, supervised periods. Mason watched with quiet joy as the dog cautiously explored the fenced area, his natural curiosity emerging from beneath layers of trauma. It was during one of these outdoor sessions that Mason first noticed the black pickup truck driving slowly past his property. He thought little of it until he saw it again the next day, and the next, always driving past at the same time, always slowing near the section of fence where Ranger would be visible from the road. On the 4th day, Mason was prepared. As the truck approached, he noted the license plate number. Ranger, who had been cautiously sniffing around a maple tree, suddenly froze. His entire body tensed, and a low, barely audible growl rumbled in his chest, the first aggressive sound Mason had heard from him. "What is it, boy?" Mason moved closer, concerned by the dramatic change in demeanor. Ranger's eyes were fixed on the passing truck, his body rigid with what Mason now recognized was not aggression, but fear. When Sheriff Cooper arrived that afternoon to follow up on his investigation, Mason shared his observation. Black Ford F-150, about 10 years old, drives by same time every day. Ranger nearly has a panic attack when he sees it. Cooper wrote down the plate number. "Could be coincidence." "You believe in coincidences, Jim?" "'Cause after 40 years in construction, I sure don't. Not when it comes to things breaking or going wrong." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll run the plates." Mason's phone rang that evening as he was preparing dinner, a simple stew that would provide meals for several days. It was his daughter Lisa calling from Denver. "Dad, Michael says you're spending your savings on a stray dog? Is that true?" Mason sighed, stirring the pot one-handed. "Your brother should mind his own business." "You are our business, Dad. Michael says you're selling Mom's things?" "Just the china neither of you wanted." "That's not the point." "What about your roof? What about your heart medication?" "I'm managing," Mason said firmly. "Dad, you can't risk your health for a stray." "Ranger's not a stray anymore. He's mine. And I don't recall asking for your permission about how I spend my money." The conversation ended tensely. Mason set down the phone and found Ranger watching him from the doorway. Having gathered enough strength to navigate the short hallway from the sunroom to the kitchen. "Well, look at you," Mason said, momentarily forgetting his frustration. "Decided to join me for dinner?" That night, Mason woke to an unfamiliar sensation, a weight pressing against his leg. He opened his eyes to find Ranger had somehow managed to climb onto the bed and was curled against him, sleeping soundly for the first time since his arrival. Careful not to disturb him, Mason gently placed a hand on the dog's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. In that moment, any doubt about his decisions vanished. Sheriff Cooper arrived unannounced the next morning, his expression grave. "Ran those plates," he said without preamble. "Truck belongs to Thomas Wilson. Goes by Red." Mason frowned. "Name's familiar. Used to work construction until an accident laid him up. Lives out past the old mill." Cooper hesitated. "He's got a history, Mason. Drunken disorderlies, couple domestic calls back when he was married. Animal Control's been out there twice on welfare complaints, but nothing they could act on. You think he had something to do with Ranger?" "Can't prove anything yet." Cooper glanced toward the sunroom where Ranger was resting. "But his reaction to the truck is telling." That afternoon, Dr. Sullivan arrived for her checkup looking troubled. After examining Ranger, she joined Mason in the kitchen, declining his offer of coffee. "I've got the lab results from Ranger's blood work," she began, placing a folder on the table. "There's something concerning. His blood shows traces of thallium." "What's that when it's at home?" "Rat poison, essentially. Low levels, but it's there. This wasn't just neglect, Mason. Someone was deliberately poisoning him. Mason felt a cold fury building inside him. Wilson. Dr. Sullivan looked startled. You know who did this? Mason explained about the truck, the timing, Ranger's reaction. Dr. Sullivan's professional composure cracked slightly. If I could prove it was intentional poisoning, we could file charges. But the levels are low enough that he could claim Ranger got into rat bait accidentally. So he gets away with it? Mason's voice rose, causing Ranger to appear in the doorway, alert to the tension. For now, Dr. Sullivan admitted. But we're documenting everything. And Ranger is safe now. Safe, yes. But the psychological damage remained evident. That weekend, Mason experimented with extending their walks to the front yard. Ranger managed well until a car backfired in the distance. The dog immediately dropped to the ground, belly pressed to the earth, trembling uncontrollably. It took Mason nearly an hour to coax him back into the house. These setbacks were discouraging, but Mason reminded himself how far they'd come. The skeletal, tick-infested creature he'd found in the ditch was now a recovering dog who could walk short distances, who responded to basic commands, who sought out human companionship despite his trauma. One morning, as Mason performed the daily wound care routine that was becoming less necessary as healing progressed, he noticed Ranger watching him with particular intensity. "What's on your mind, boy?" he asked conversationally. In response, Ranger slowly, deliberately extended his paw, placing it on Mason's arm. The gesture was so intentional, so communicative, that Mason found his vision blurring with unexpected emotion. "Yeah," he said roughly, clearing his throat. "I'm glad I found you, too." That night, Mason experienced a concerning episode, chest pains that woke him from sleep, accompanied by shortness of breath and a cold sweat. He sat up in bed, reaching for his medication with trembling fingers. Ranger immediately roused beside him, alert to his distress. As Mason waited for the nitroglycerin to take effect, he felt Ranger press against his side, offering warmth and silent companionship through the frightening minutes until the pain subsided. "Good boy," Mason whispered, his hand finding Ranger's head in the darkness. "I'm all right now." Thanks to you. But he wasn't all right, and in the morning light he couldn't deny it any longer. The episode had been worse than previous ones, the recovery slower. As he called Dr. Phillips' office to schedule the appointment he'd been avoiding, Mason glanced at Ranger, now peacefully eating breakfast. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd saved the dog's life, and now, perhaps, the dog was saving his by forcing him to confront his own mortality. From the living room window, Mason noticed the black pickup driving past again, slower this time. The driver's silhouette was visible, head turned toward Mason's property. Ranger, sensing something, abandoned his food bowl and came to stand beside Mason, body tense but no longer trembling in terror. "Don't worry, boy," Mason said quietly, placing a protective hand on Ranger's head. "He can't hurt you anymore." But as the truck disappeared down the road, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that their story with Thomas Wilson was far from over. 8 weeks after that fateful day by the drainage ditch, Ranger trotted beside Mason across the backyard, his once skeletal frame now carrying a healthier weight. Though still underweight, his transformation bordered on miraculous. Patches of new fur gleamed in the morning light, and his eyes, once clouded with pain, were clear and alert. He moved with increasing confidence, only a slight hitch in his gait, betraying the lingering weakness in his hind legs. "That's it, boy," Mason encouraged, as Ranger navigated the small obstacle course he'd fashioned from garden planters and old milk crates. "Show 'em what you're made of." Sarah watched from the porch, coffee mug in hand. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. He's like a different animal." "Same animal," Mason corrected, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "Just needed someone to believe in him." Mason had noticed how the neighborhood's attitude toward him had shifted since Ranger's arrival. Neighbors who had previously offered only perfunctory waves now stopped to chat. The mail carrier brought dog biscuits. Even Pastor Williams made regular visits, ostensibly to check on Ranger, but often staying for long conversations about faith and second chances. The Jameson Gazette called again, Sarah mentioned casually. "They're doing a feature on local hero pets and heard about Ranger." Mason frowned. "Don't need our business in the papers. People are inspired, Mason. A dying dog, a stubborn old man. It's a story folks need right now." Before Mason could respond, his phone rang. Dr. Phillips' office, confirming tomorrow's appointment. The reminder brought a familiar tightness to his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. The preliminary tests had revealed concerning results, necessitating a more comprehensive evaluation. The recommended procedure carried a price tag that made Mason's remaining savings look woefully inadequate. He hadn't shared the details with anyone, not Dr. Sullivan, not Sheriff Cooper, and certainly not his children. The choice loomed before him like a dark cloud. His health or Ranger's ongoing care. The dog still required medication, special food, and regular veterinary checkups. The roof still needed repairs before winter. Something would have to give. Later that afternoon, Mason ventured into town for supplies, leaving Ranger safely secured in the sunroom, with the radio playing softly for company, a trick Dr. Sullivan had suggested to ease separation anxiety. The local hardware store, Jenkins Supply, had been a Saturday ritual for Mason since his construction days. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Old Man Jenkins called from behind the counter. "Heard your rescue dog's doing better." Mason nodded, selecting the wood screws he needed for reinforcing the porch steps. "Getting stronger every day. Local hero, that's what my granddaughter calls him. Her class at the elementary school is writing stories about him." The thought of school children writing about Ranger brought an unexpected lump to Mason's throat. He cleared it gruffly. "Just a dog doing what dogs do. Surviving." As Mason gathered his purchases, he noticed a familiar black pickup truck parked across the street. His body tensed instinctively. Through the hardware store window, he could see Thomas Wilson emerging from the liquor store, a paper bag tucked under his arm. Without conscious thought, Mason found himself heading for the door. "Put these on my account, would you, Jenkins?" he called over his shoulder. "Got something to attend to." Outside, the summer heat hit like a physical wall. Mason squinted against the brightness, focusing on Wilson's retreating figure. The man moved with the stiff gait of someone carrying old injuries, his red hair now streaked with gray. "Wilson!" Mason called. The man turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he took in Mason's approach. Recognition flickered across his weathered face. "You're the one with my dog," Wilson said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Mason stopped several feet away, aware of curious onlookers from nearby shops. "Your dog? The one left to die in a drainage ditch? The one covered in thousands of ticks and poisoned?" Wilson's expression darkened. "Don't know what you're talking about, old man. Sheriff Cooper ran your plates. You've been driving by my place, watching." Mason stepped closer, ignoring the warning pain in his chest. "What kind of man does that to an animal?" Wilson's face flushed, matching his nickname. "That mutt got what he deserved." The words were slurred slightly, suggesting the paper bag wasn't his first drink of the day. He was a rescue dog. He saved lives. Mason could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. "Didn't save my boy, did he?" Wilson snarled, a flash of raw grief breaking through his belligerent exterior. "All those people he supposedly saved, but not my Jeremy," found his way out himself, while that useless animal barked in circles. The non sequitur caught Mason off guard. "What are you talking about?" But Wilson was already turning away, shoulders hunched defensively. "Keep the damn dog. He's as worthless to me as he was that night." Mason watched him go, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed clicking partially into place. The confrontation left him shaken, his heart racing dangerously. He made his way to a bench outside the post office, sitting heavily as he fumbled for his nitroglycerin tablets. Sheriff Cooper found him there 10 minutes later, alerted by a concerned Jenkins who had witnessed the exchange. "You all right, Mason?" Jenkins said you looked ready to collapse. Mason waved away the concern. "I'm fine." But Wilson admitted it, Jim. Said Ranger got what he deserved. That's admission of guilt, isn't it? Cooper sat beside him, his expression troubled. "It's something. Not enough for charges yet, but it gives us direction." He paused. "He mentioned his son?" "Jeremy said something about Ranger not saving him, about the boy finding his own way out, while the dog barked in circles. None of it made sense." Cooper's face grew somber. "Actually, it might. I've been looking into Wilson's background. 8 years ago, there was a house fire at his place. His son Jeremy, just 6 years old, was trapped inside. By the time fire rescue arrived, the boy had already suffered severe smoke inhalation. He died 3 days later in the hospital." "And Ranger was there?" Mason asked, confused. "I don't know yet. But the timing fits his service record. I'm waiting on the full incident report." Mason returned home to find Ranger waiting anxiously by the sunroom door, relief evident in his whole body as Mason entered. The dog pressed against his legs, a gesture of reassurance that had become their ritual greeting. "Sorry I'm late, boy," Mason said, kneeling despite his protesting joints to embrace the dog. "Had a run-in with someone from your past." That evening, local news featured a segment about the miracle dog of Chester County, complete with before and after photographs Dr. Sullivan had provided. Mason watched with mixed emotions as the reporter praised the community's efforts and his dedication. The publicity felt invasive, yet he couldn't deny the swell of pride as viewers saw Ranger's remarkable recovery. His phone began ringing almost immediately. First Michael, then Lisa, both more conciliatory than in previous calls, impressed, despite themselves, by their father's determination and the dog's resilience. Then came calls from long-forgotten acquaintances, distant relatives, even Martha's old bridge club members. By the time Mason unplugged the phone, his emotional reserves were depleted. "Too much fuss for an old man and his dog, eh?" he murmured to Ranger, who had remained loyally by his side through each call. "Tomorrow's going to be a longer day. Best get some rest." Morning brought the dreaded appointment with Dr. Phillips. Mason rose early, his movements slow and deliberate as he attended to Ranger's needs before his own. The dog sensed something amiss, following Mason with unusual attentiveness, pressing close when Mason sat to tie his shoes. "I'll be back soon," Mason promised, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "Sarah will look in on you at noon." Dr. Phillips' office was sterile and cold, the examination thorough and concerning. The cardiologist's expression remained professionally neutral as he reviewed test results, but Mason had spent too many years reading structural problems in buildings not to recognize trouble when he saw it. "The echocardiogram shows significant progression of your condition, Mr. Carter," Dr. Phillips explained, gesturing to images Mason couldn't begin to decipher. "The valve stenosis has worsened, and there's evidence of reduced blood flow to the heart muscle itself." Mason nodded stoically. "Cut to the chase, Doc. How bad?" Without intervention, you're at high risk for a major cardiac event, a heart attack or sudden cardiac arrest. Given your recent symptoms, I'm recommending surgery as soon as possible. The numbers that followed hit harder than the diagnosis. Even with Medicare, Mason's portion would consume the remainder of his savings, and then some. And that was before factoring in recovery time, during which he'd need help not just for himself, but for Ranger. "How long do I have to decide?" Mason asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Dr. Phillips frowned. "This isn't elective surgery, Mr. Carter. We should schedule within the next 2 weeks, if possible." Mason left the office with a folder of information, prescription slips, and a heaviness that had nothing to do with his physical heart. The impossible choice loomed larger than ever. By the time he arrived home, he had resolved to call Michael, not to ask for money, but to discuss options for Ranger if the worst should happen. He found his driveway blocked by Sheriff Cooper's cruiser and an unfamiliar car with county government plates. Cooper and Dr. Sullivan stood on his porch, expressions grave. "What's happened?" Mason demanded, fear clutching at him. "Is Ranger all right?" "Ranger's fine," Cooper assured him, "but we need to talk. This is Miss Winters from County Animal Services." Inside, Ranger greeted Mason with obvious relief, pressing against him protectively as the visitors settled in the living room. Miss Winters, a stern-faced woman in her 40s with a clipboard and an air of bureaucratic authority, came directly to the point. "Mr. Carter, we've received a formal claim of ownership for the dog you've been calling Ranger. Thomas Wilson has provided documentation showing he legally adopted the animal 3 years ago from Mid-Atlantic Rescue Service." Mason's face hardened. "The same Thomas Wilson who left him to die? Who poisoned him? Who's been driving by my house to intimidate him?" "Alleged abuse is a separate issue, Mr. Carter. Ownership is straightforward. Either you have documentation, or you don't." Dr. Sullivan interjected, her voice controlled but intense. "This dog was found abandoned, covered in parasites, malnourished, and poisoned. Miss Winters, surely the county has protocols for suspected abuse cases." "We do," Ms. Winters acknowledged, "and Animal Services will investigate those claims. But in the meantime, legal ownership must be established." Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. "There's more to this than paperwork, Catherine. I've been investigating connections between Wilson and this dog's service history." "Suspected connections," she corrected. "Without concrete evidence, we have to follow procedure. Mr. Wilson has filed for reclamation and provided the necessary documentation." The conversation continued in this vein, with Mason growing increasingly silent. Ranger, sensing his distress, remained pressed firmly against his leg, occasionally looking up with concerned eyes. After Miss Winters left with a warning that a determination would be made within days, Sheriff Cooper and Dr. Sullivan stayed behind. "This is ridiculous," Dr. Sullivan fumed. "After everything that dog has been through, after all you've done, they can't just hand him back to his abuser." "Actually, they can," Cooper said grimly, "unless we can prove the abuse. I'm still waiting on those fire reports, but they're archived records. Takes time." "Time we don't have," Mason said quietly, his first words since the officials had left. He ran a hand over Ranger's head, now pressing firmly against his knee. "I saw Dr. Phillips today." The change of subject caught them off guard. "Your heart?" Dr. Sullivan asked, concern shifting directions. Mason nodded. "Needs surgery. Soon. And expensive." He gestured vaguely around his modest home. "Was already wondering how to manage it all. And now this." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken concern. Finally, Cooper stood. "I'll keep pushing on the investigation." "Don't give up yet, Mason. After they left, Mason sat with Ranger in the fading afternoon lights. The dog's transformation over these weeks had been remarkable, from the brink of death to a living embodiment of resilience. Mason had witnessed the return of dignity to those intelligent eyes, had seen the gradual rebuilding of trust. The thought of Ranger returning to Wilson's custody was unbearable, yet the reality of Mason's health couldn't be ignored. The pressure in his chest had become a constant companion, the shortness of breath more frequent. He had promised Martha he would open his heart again, but he hadn't anticipated it would be his actual heart that failed him when he finally did. That evening, local news featured a follow-up segment on Ranger's story, this time including interviews with community members who had contributed to his care. The reporter closed with an update. In a surprising development, a man claiming to be Ranger's original owner has come forward. The county will determine custody in the coming days. Meanwhile, community support for the once-dying dog and his elderly rescuer continues to grow. Mason's phone began ringing again almost immediately. This time he didn't unplug it. Instead, he answered call after call, listening to neighbors and strangers alike offering support, legal advice, and in some cases, outrage. By the time Michael called, Mason had begun to understand that Ranger's story had touched something deep in the community's collective consciousness. "Dad, Lisa and I have been talking," Michael began without preamble. "We're coming home tomorrow. Whatever's happening with your heart, with this dog situation, you shouldn't be facing it alone." For once, Mason didn't argue. As he hung up, he felt Ranger's warm weight against his leg and looked down to find those intelligent eyes watching him. "Looks like you're about to meet the rest of the family, boy," he said softly. "Let's just hope it's not too little, too late." The county courthouse stood as it had for over a century, a stolid brick edifice with white columns and an air of immovable authority. Mason sat rigidly on a wooden bench in the hallway, dressed in his only suit, the collar uncomfortably tight around his neck. Michael and Lisa flanked him like sentinels, their presence both comforting and foreign after so many years of handling crises alone. "The judge has a good reputation," Michael murmured, checking his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. His corporate efficiency had kicked in upon arrival, organizing paperwork, consulting with the attorney he'd insisted on hiring, making calls to his contacts in local government. Lisa reached over to straighten Mason's tie. "Try not to worry, Dad. The community's behind you." Indeed, the courthouse hallway was filled with familiar faces. Sarah Bennett, Pastor Williams, Dr. Sullivan, even Old Man Jenkins from the hardware store. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about Ranger's journey and the custody dispute, prompting an outpouring of support that had caught Mason off guard. Ranger himself remained at home, with Sheriff Cooper's deputies standing guard, a precaution after Wilson had been spotted driving past the property 3 times the previous day. The courtroom doors opened, and the bailiff called for all parties in the Wilson versus Carter case to enter. Mason rose slowly, conscious of the stiffness in his joints and the irregular fluttering in his chest that had become more pronounced since his cardiology appointment. Judge Harriet Montgomery, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes behind rimless glasses, presided over the hearing with brisk efficiency. Wilson sat at one table with his attorney, a harried-looking public defender. Mason and his family occupied the other censures, joined by the lawyer Michael had retained, a polished woman named Rebecca Steinman, who specialized in animal welfare cases. "This is a simple property dispute," Wilson's attorney began. "Mr. Wilson has provided documentation proving he legally adopted the animal in question 3 years ago from Mid-Atlantic Rescue Service. While the dog was temporarily missing from his custody, ownership was never surrendered or transferred. Miss Steinman countered with photographs of Ranger's condition when Mason found him, Doctor. Sullivan's medical testimony about the thallium poisoning, and affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed Wilson's truck repeatedly driving by Mason's property. Your Honor, this isn't merely about property rights, she argued. This is about the welfare of an animal who was subjected to severe neglect and abuse, and about recognizing the extraordinary efforts Mr. Carter has made to rehabilitate him. Judge Montgomery interrupted, peering over her glasses. Miss Steinman, I appreciate the emotional aspects of this case, but Pennsylvania law is clear. Dogs are considered personal property. Unless Mr. Wilson has been convicted of animal cruelty, which I note he has not been, his property rights remain intact. The proceedings continued with clinical detachment that belied the life-and-death stakes for Ranger. Mason found himself struggling to focus as witnesses were called and legal arguments made. The pressure in his chest had intensified, and a cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. Lisa noticed first. "Dad, are you okay?" she whispered, her hand closing over his. Mason nodded tightly, unwilling to detract from the proceedings. But as Wilson took the stand, describing his deep attachment to the dog he called Rex, the room began to tilt alarmingly. "He ran away during a thunderstorm," Wilson testified, his face a mask of practiced concern. "I searched everywhere, put up posters. I was heartbroken." The blatant lies triggered something in Mason, anger surging through him, sending his pulse racing dangerously. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself as black spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Your Honor," Ms. Steinman said suddenly, "Sheriff Cooper has just entered with new evidence that's directly relevant to this case." Judge Montgomery nodded for Cooper to approach. The sheriff handed over a thick folder, speaking in low tones that Mason couldn't make out through the rushing sound in his ears. After reviewing the documents, Judge Montgomery's expression changed subtly. "Mr. Wilson, were you present at the Oak Ridge subdivision fire on June 15th, 8 years ago?" Wilson's face drained of color. "That's not relevant to this case." "I'll determine what's relevant, Mr. Wilson. Please answer the question." "Yes," he said after a long pause, "that was my home. My son died in that fire." "And was the dog in question, then known by the service name Atlas, present at that fire as part of the rescue team?" Wilson's attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but Wilson pushed him away. "Yes," he admitted, his voice hollow. "The useless mutt was supposed to find my boy. Failed at his one job." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Montgomery studied the documents before her, then looked directly at Wilson. "Mr. Wilson, these incident reports indicate that Canine Atlas located your son within 4 minutes of entering the bid structure, leading firefighters directly to him. Your son was alive when rescued and transported to Chester County Hospital." Wilson's hands began to shake. They said he breathed in too much smoke. Said his lungs were damaged, said there was nothing they could do. "I understand your grief, Mr. Wilson, but the record clearly shows this dog performed his duty with distinction. He did not fail your son." Mason felt the room spinning more violently now. Michael's voice sounded far away as he asked, "Dad? Dad, what's wrong?" The last thing Mason saw before darkness closed in was Wilson's face. Not angry anymore, but crumpled with a grief that mirrored his own when he'd lost Martha. Mason awoke to the sterile white ceiling of Chester County Hospital. The rhythmic beeping of monitors a familiar accompaniment to the dull pain in his chest. Lisa sat beside the bed, her face lined with worry as she spoke softly into her phone. "He's awake. I'll call you back." "Ranger?" Mason's voice came out as a rasp. "He's okay, Dad. Sarah's with him." Lisa poured water from a plastic pitcher, helping him take small sips. "You had a heart attack in the courtroom. They rushed you into surgery." Mason's hand moved instinctively to his chest, feeling the bandages beneath the hospital gown. "The hearing? Postponed, officially." Lisa squeezed his hand. "But Sheriff Cooper says Judge Montgomery was pretty clear about which way she was leaning before the medical emergency." Dr. Phillips appeared in the doorway, chart in hand. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. You gave us quite a scare. The surgery went well. We placed a stent to open the blocked artery. You're lucky. If this had happened when you were alone at home, the outcome might have been very different." The following days passed in a blur of medical jargon, visits from concerned friends, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability that Mason hadn't experienced since Martha's final days. Michael extended his stay indefinitely, taking over Mason's bedroom while Mason recovered. Lisa arranged for a leave of absence from her job, setting up a makeshift office in the sunroom. The most difficult part was being separated from Ranger. Hospital policy prohibited pets, even one as famous as the miracle dog of Chester County had become. Dr. Sullivan provided daily updates and smartphone videos of Ranger, who appeared increasingly anxious in Mason's absence. "He's not eating well," Dr. Sullivan reported on day 3. "Keeps looking for you, searching the house." Mason, still tethered to monitors and IV lines, felt a corresponding ache that had nothing to do with his surgery. "Tell him I'm coming home soon." On the 5th day, as Mason was attempting to eat the hospital's version of meatloaf, Sheriff Cooper appeared in the doorway. "You up for a visitor?" he asked. Before Mason could respond, Cooper stepped aside, revealing Thomas Wilson. The man looked markedly different from the belligerent figure in the courtroom. Shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot from something other than alcohol, hands fidgeting with the brim of a worn baseball cap. Mason's immediate instinct was refusal, but something in Wilson's demeanor gave him pause. He nodded once, and Cooper stepped out, leaving the two men facing each other across an expanse wider than the hospital room. "They said you nearly died," Wilson began awkwardly, "in the courtroom." Mason nodded. "Happens when you get old. Parts wear out." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Finally, Wilson spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been wrong. About a lot of things." He twisted the cap in his hands. "That dog, Ranger, Atlas, whatever his name is, he didn't fail Jeremy, I did. Passed out drunk while my boy played with matches upstairs." Wilson's voice broke. "Easier to blame the dog than face that." Mason said nothing, allowing the man's confession to unfold. "I withdrew my claim this morning," Wilson continued. "Signed the papers giving up all rights to him. He's yours now, legally." He met Mason's gaze for the first time. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what I did to him, for what I put you through." Before Mason could respond, Wilson turned and walked out, leaving behind the scent of regret and the first stirrings of what might have been forgiveness. That evening, Dr. Phillips delivered unexpected news. "Your insurance approved home care for your recovery," he announced. "We can discharge you tomorrow, provided you have adequate support at home." "He does," Michael confirmed from the doorway, where he stood with Lisa and Dr. Sullivan. "We've got everything arranged." What they had arranged, Mason discovered upon returning home the following afternoon, was nothing short of a homecoming celebration. Neighbors had gathered on his front lawn, a hand-painted banner reading, "Welcome home, Mason and Ranger," stretching across the porch. But the true celebration came when Sarah emerged from the house with Ranger on a leash. The dog froze for a moment, eyes locked on Mason being helped from the car. Then, with a joyous bark that seemed to contain all the emotion of their shared journey, Ranger bounded forward, stopping just short of jumping on his fragile human. Instead, pressing his body against Mason's legs with unmistakable relief. For the first time since the courthouse, Mason felt his heart beating with something other than pain. The autumn leaves drifted lazily across Mason's front yard as he eased himself into the porch rocker, a quilt draped over his knees despite the mild October afternoon. 2 months had passed since his surgery, a period of slow recovery marked by small victories and persistent challenges. Ranger lay at his feet, alert eyes tracking a squirrel's progress across the yard, but body remaining loyally positioned beside his. Human. Mason Carter, if you've been lifting those bags of mulch again, I swear I'll call your children. Dr. Sullivan admonished as she climbed the porch steps, medical bag in hand. Just supervising, Mason replied with a wry smile, gesturing toward Michael, who was indeed spreading mulch around Martha's perennial beds in preparation for winter. Dr. Sullivan's visits had transitioned from daily medical checkups to weekly social calls that happened to include blood pressure readings and medication reviews. Today, however, she carried an official-looking envelope along with her usual bag. "Sheriff Cooper asked me to drop this by," she explained, handing over the envelope. "The complete file on the Oak Ridge fire. He thought you should have it." Mason took the envelope but didn't immediately open it. "Not sure I need to dredge all that up again. Wilson's gone. Ranger's legally mine. Case closed. Sometimes understanding the whole story helps with healing," Dr. Sullivan said softly. "For both of you," she nodded toward Ranger, who had perked up at Wilson's name, a lingering response they were working to desensitize. After she'd gone, Mason sat with the unopened envelope on his lap, watching Michael work in the garden. His son had extended his visits into what was beginning to look like a permanent return, taking over the upstairs bedroom and gradually sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Lisa had returned to Denver, but called daily, coordinating with local contractors about the roof repairs now scheduled for next week. The familial involvement that Mason had once resisted now felt like a sturdy framework supporting his recovery. Even more surprising was the community that had rallied around him, from Pastor Williams organizing a medication delivery schedule to Sarah bringing her legendary pot roast every Sunday. The isolation that had defined his widowhood had been quietly, persistently dismantled by a half-dead dog found in a drainage ditch. Finally, Mason opened the envelope. Inside was the official fire investigation report, complete with photographs, witness statements, and the detailed timeline of rescue efforts. He began reading. Ranger shifting position to press closer against his legs, as if sensing the heaviness of the moment. The report painted a devastatingly clear picture. The fire had started in the Wilson family kitchen. Faulty wiring in a coffee maker, not Jeremy playing with matches, as Wilson had claimed. Thomas Wilson had indeed been intoxicated, but was not unconscious. He had attempted to reach the second floor, where Jeremy was sleeping, but was driven back by smoke and flames. Neighbors had restrained him from re-entering the burning structure until fire crews arrived. K9 Atlas, Ranger, had entered the building with his handler, a firefighter named Robert Martinez. According to Martinez's statement, the dog had immediately indicated toward the second floor and led rescuers to Jeremy's bedroom closet, where the boy had hidden from the smoke. Jeremy was extracted within 4 minutes of the team's entry, still breathing but suffering from severe smoke inhalation. The medical examiner's report was attached. Extensive smoke damage to the lungs, carbon monoxide poisoning. The emergency room doctor who had treated Jeremy was listed as Eleanor Sullivan, M.D. Mason paused, rereading the name with a jolt of recognition. Before her veterinary career, Dr. Sullivan had been an emergency physician. She had been the one to pronounce Jeremy Wilson dead after 3 days in intensive care. The final pages contained the official commendation for Canine Atlas and Handler Martinez, noting that their actions had given Jeremy his only chance at survival. The injury that had eventually led to Atlas's retirement was documented as well. A partially collapsed ceiling had struck the dog during a secondary search of the premises, resulting in damage to his left rear leg. As Mason digested this information, the missing pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Not just Wilson's hatred for the dog he blamed for his son's death, but Dr. Sullivan's particular investment in Ranger's recovery, her understanding of Wilson's grief, her decision to transition from human to veterinary medicine after what must have been a devastating loss. Mason was still sitting with the open file when Michael joined him on the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heavy reading?" his son asked, noting Mason's expression. Mason handed over the file silently, watching as Michael scanned the documents, his eyes widening at certain passages. Dr. Sullivan was the ER doctor? Michael looked up in surprise. "Did you know?" Mason shook his head. "Makes sense now. Her connection to Ranger, to this whole situation." A car door slammed at the bottom of the driveway, interrupting their conversation. Sheriff Cooper approached, accompanied by a well-dressed woman carrying a briefcase. "Hope we're not interrupting," Cooper called. "This is Rachel Harmon from the District Attorney's Office. She'd like to speak with you about Thomas Wilson." Inside, seated around the kitchen table with coffee cups steaming before them, Miss Harmon came directly to the point. "We've built a strong case against Mr. Wilson for animal cruelty, abandonment, and poisoning," she explained. "The evidence is compelling, including the toxicology reports and Mr. Wilson's own admissions. We're prepared to proceed with charges." Mason nodded slowly, his hand automatically finding Ranger's head beside his chair. "What's that mean for Wilson?" "Given the severity of the case and Mr. Wilson's prior record, he's facing significant jail time," Miss Harmon replied. "Pennsylvania has strengthened its animal cruelty laws in recent years. This would be a felony case." Mason considered this, thinking of the broken man who had stood in his hospital room, hat in hand, confessing his failures. Wilson needs help more than punishment. Been punishing himself for 8 years already. Ms. Harmon exchanged glances with Sheriff Cooper. "That's actually why we're here, Mr. Carter. Mr. Wilson has offered to plead guilty, but his attorney has proposed an alternative sentencing arrangement that would require your approval." The proposal was unexpected. Instead of jail time, Wilson would enter a residential rehabilitation program for his alcoholism, following by community service at the county animal shelter and mandatory psychiatric treatment. He would also make restitution payments to cover Ranger's medical expenses. "Why does this need my approval?" Mason asked. "Because you're the victim in this case," Ms. Harmon explained. "While the state brings the charges, your position on sentencing carries significant weight with the judge. Additionally, the community service component would potentially place Mr. Wilson in proximity to animal welfare organizations you support. We wouldn't proceed with this arrangement if you objected." Mason was silent for a long moment, his eyes meeting Michael's across the table. His son gave a small nod, supporting whatever decision Mason made. "I've spent enough of my life holding on to things," Mason said finally. "Tell Wilson I accept his proposal, on one condition. He needs to make amends, not just to me and Ranger, but to Dr. Sullivan as well. She deserves that much." After the officials departed, Michael studied his father with newfound respect. "That was generous of you," Mason shrugged. "Just practical. Locking him up doesn't undo what happened to Ranger or bring back his boy. Maybe this way something good comes from all the pain." That evening, as Mason prepared for bed, a process that now included a complex regimen of medications, he heard Michael on the phone in the hallway. "No, Lisa, he's doing better than expected." Stubborn old goat. Michael's voice carried affection beneath the exasperation. "The contractors confirmed for Monday. New roof before the first snow." Mason smiled to himself. Martha would have enjoyed seeing their children step up this way, working together, despite the geographical and temperamental distances that had separated them in adulthood. As if sensing his thoughts, Ranger padded into the bedroom, having been officially cleared by Dr. Sullivan to sleep on the bed during Mason's recovery. "Come on up, boy." Mason patted the quilt beside him. "Reckon we've both earned some rest." The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sullivan arrived not for her usual checkup, but bearing a cardboard box filled with files. "I owe you an explanation," she said without preamble, setting the box on the kitchen table. "Sheriff Cooper told me he gave you the fire report." Mason gestured for her to sit. "You're the doctor who treated Jeremy Wilson." She nodded, her professional composure faltering slightly. "One of several, but I was on duty when we lost him. It was my third pediatric fatality that month, all preventable tragedies. I burned out, Mason. Couldn't face another parent like Thomas Wilson, wild with grief, demanding answers I couldn't give. So you switched to four-legged patients," Mason finished for her. "Veterinary school at 45, she confirmed with a wry smile. "My colleagues thought I'd lost my mind." Maybe I had. She opened the box, removing a photograph of a much younger Dr. Sullivan in emergency room scrubs, kneeling beside a German shepherd in a service vest. "This was my first encounter with Atlas, with Ranger." He was part of the crisis response team that came to the hospital after a particularly difficult night in the ER. I never forgot him. Mason studied the photograph, recognizing the distinctive white markings on Ranger's chest. "You knew who he was the moment I brought him in." "Not immediately. He was in such terrible condition. But when I found the service tattoo..." She paused, collecting herself. The coincidence seemed impossible. The same dog, connected to both Wilson's tragedy and now to you. "I couldn't tell you then. Confidentiality, both medical and legal. But now that it's all in the open, now we all get a second chance," Mason said quietly. "You, me, Ranger, maybe even Wilson." Dr. Sullivan reached across the table to grasp his hand. "I've been offered a position with the Regional Animal Rescue Consortium, developing a specialized program for rehabilitating service animals. They want Ranger as their first case study, once he's fully recovered." "You're leaving your practice?" "Transitioning," she corrected. "Fewer sprained paws, more meaningful work. At our age, isn't that what we're all looking for?" Mason thought about this as he watched Ranger and Michael through the window, engaged in a careful game of fetch that respected both the dog's healing leg and Mason's newly repaired heart. Second acts, second chances. The pattern of their interconnected lives seemed less random now, more like a tapestry whose design only became clear when viewed from a distance. That afternoon, as golden October light bathed the yard, Mason's phone rang. It was Rebecca Steinman, the attorney who had represented him in the custody case. "Mr. Carter, I just received some paperwork you should know about," she began. "Thomas Wilson has formally requested that the court records acknowledge Ranger's service history. He's petitioning to have the dog's original commendation for the Oak Ridge Fire Rescue reinstated in the Ward County records." "Meaning what, exactly?" Mason asked. "Meaning he's publicly acknowledging that Ranger performed his duty heroically that night. It's a significant retraction of his previous claims." She paused. "There's more. Wilson has enrolled in the rehabilitation program. and has already begun the intake process. His first counseling session was yesterday. After hanging up, Mason sat on the porch steps, watching as Ranger explored the yard with newfound confidence. The dog, who had once been too weak to stand, now moved with increasing grace, his body rebuilding itself through the same combination of medical intervention and sheer determination that had saved Mason's life. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Mason murmured as Ranger returned to settle beside him, head resting on his knee. The truth about their intertwined paths, Ranger's, Wilson's, Dr. Sullivan's, and his own, had been hidden beneath layers of grief and misunderstanding, like Ranger's identity concealed beneath thousands of ticks. Now exposed to the light, that truth offered not just clarity, but the possibility of healing for all of them. 1 year later, Mason stood at the edge of the community park, watching as Ranger demonstrated a search pattern for a group of wide-eyed children. The German Shepherd moved with purpose, his once skeletal frame now robust and powerful, coat gleaming in the spring sunshine. At Dr. Sullivan's command, he located a volunteer hidden behind the playground equipment, barking triumphantly to signal a successful find. And that's how search dogs help find people who are lost or trapped, Dr. Sullivan explained to the elementary school field trip gathered around her. "Ranger here was one of the best in his day, and he's helping us train our next generation of rescue dogs." A small girl raised her hand. "Did he get those scars from saving people?" Dr. Sullivan exchanged a glance with Mason before answering. "Some of them, yes. Others remind us that even heroes can need rescuing sometimes." The Chester County Animal Rescue Center's grand opening celebration had drawn a substantial crowd. The converted warehouse now housed state-of-the-art training facilities, veterinary treatment rooms, and rehabilitation spaces for injured and traumatized animals. Dr. Sullivan's vision, bolstered by unprecedented community support and a substantial grant from a national animal welfare organization, had transformed from dream to reality in just 10 months. Mason made his way carefully through the gathering, nodding to familiar faces. His pace remained deliberate, a lasting reminder of his cardiac event, but the color had returned to his cheeks, and the consistent exercise prescribed as part of his recovery had trimmed his frame and strengthened his endurance. "There he is, the man of the hour!" Pastor Williams clapped Mason on the shoulder. "Though I suspect Ranger's stealing your thunder again." Mason chuckled. "He's welcome to it. Never did care much for being the center of attention." That was undeniably what they had become, however. The story of the tick dog and his elderly rescuer had captured hearts far beyond Chester County. A documentary filmmaker had featured them in a piece about animal rescue that had won awards at several festivals. Donations had poured in, not just for Ranger's ongoing care, but for the rescue center itself, which bore a plaque dedicating its main training arena to Atlas/Ranger, twice a hero. Michael approached, clipboard in hand. "Dad, they're ready for the ribbon cutting whenever you are." Lisa's got the camera all set up. Mason nodded, still marveling at how completely his life had transformed. Michael had made his return to Chester County permanent, taking a remote position with his firm and renovating the old barn on the property into a modern home office. Lisa visited monthly, her Denver condo now on the market, as she explored relocations closer to her roots. The family home itself had undergone a transformation nearly as dramatic as Ranger's. New roof, updated heating system, ramp alongside the porch steps, and grab bars in the bathrooms. Practical changes that acknowledged Mason's limitations while enabling his.
independence.
The sunroom, where Ranger had begun his recovery, was now a cheerful sitting area where Mason often hosted his expanding circle of friends. As they made their way toward the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the entrance to the training arena, Mason caught sight of a familiar figure standing somewhat apart from the crowd. Thomas Wilson looked markedly different from the angry, dissolute man of a year ago. Clean-shaven, clear-eyed, his posture straightened by sobriety and purpose, he nodded respectfully to Mason, but maintained his distance. Following the terms of his alternative sentencing, Wilson had completed 6 months of residential rehabilitation, followed by outpatient therapy. His community service hours at the county animal shelter had gradually evolved into a part-time position. His natural aptitude with troubled animals surprising everyone, perhaps none more than Wilson himself. The relationship between Mason and Wilson remained cautious, their interactions limited mostly to necessary communication regarding the rescue center, where Wilson now volunteered on weekends. Yet there existed between them a fragile understanding, born of shared grief and unexpected redemption. Ready for your big moment? Dr. Sullivan appeared at Mason's elbow, Ranger at her heels. Her new role as director of the rescue center had energized her, erasing years from her appearance and infusing her professional expertise with renewed passion. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mason replied, accepting the large ceremonial scissors, "though I still think you should be the one doing this." "It's your vision we're celebrating. It's all of ours," she corrected, gesturing toward Ranger, who had positioned himself precisely at Mason's side. Some partnerships are meant to be. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was brief but emotional, Mason's weathered hands steady as he addressed the gathered crowd. "A year ago, I found a dying dog in a ditch, or maybe he found me. Either way, we saved each other." His voice roughened slightly. "This center isn't just about rescuing animals. It's about recognizing that healing works both ways. The animals we save often end up saving us right back." As applause erupted, Mason felt a familiar pressure against his leg, Ranger's way of offering support, a gesture that had evolved from their earliest days together. He reached down to stroke the dog's head, murmuring, "We did good, boy." The afternoon unfolded in a series of demonstrations, tours, and congratulatory conversations. Mason gradually withdrew to a quiet corner, the social exertion taking its toll despite his improved stamina. He found a bench beneath a shade tree and settled there, watching as Ranger participated in another demonstration with a young handler. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas Wilson stood uncertainly beside the bench, hands thrust deep in his pockets. Mason considered him for a moment before nodding toward the empty space. "Free country." They sat in silence for several minutes, both watching Ranger work. Finally, Wilson spoke, his voice low and measured. "They're saying he's the best training assistant they've ever had. Natural talent for showing the younger dogs what to do." "Always was exceptional," Mason agreed. "Just needed someone to see it." Wilson nodded, his gaze fixed on the German Shepherd. "My therapist says I projected all my guilt onto him. Easier to blame a dog than face my own failures." He paused. Jeremy would have been 14 now. Mason thought of his own losses. Martha, the years estranged from his children, the isolation he'd built around himself like a wall. Grief makes us do strange things. Build walls or burn bridges. Neither one helps much in the end. "No," Wilson agreed quietly. "It doesn't." Another silence fell between them, less strained than before. "I heard they approved your application," Mason said eventually, "for the handling course." Wilson nodded, a hint of pride crossing his features. "Basic certification to start. Dr. Sullivan thinks I have a knack for the rehabilitative cases. Dogs others have given up on." "Fitting," Mason observed without rancor. The celebration continued around them, the rescue center humming with activity and purpose. Sarah Bennett approached with a plate of food, clucking disapprovingly at Mason for hiding away when everyone wanted to congratulate him. Wilson excused himself, melting back into the crowd with a respectful nod. As evening approached, the gathering began to disperse. Mason found himself on the newly constructed observation deck overlooking the training fields. Ranger, a warm presence at his side. Dr. Sullivan joined them, her professional attire exchanged for comfortable jeans and a center logo sweatshirt. "Quite a day," she remarked, gazing out at the facility now illuminated by the setting sun. "Hard to believe where we started." Mason nodded, thinking of the half-dead creature he'd found a year ago, of his own isolated existence, of the unlikely chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. "Sheriff Cooper's bringing Wilson home," Dr. Sullivan mentioned. "He asked me to tell you he'll come by tomorrow to finish that railing on your back steps, if that's still all right." "It's all right," Mason confirmed, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Later, as Mason and Ranger settled onto the porch swing for their evening ritual, Michael emerged from his office with a tablet in hand. "Look what Lisa sent," he said, showing Mason a video of his daughter, signing the final papers on a house just 20 minutes away. She'll be moved in by the 4th of July. Mason watched the video, a sense of completion warming him more thoroughly than the spring evening. The family that had scattered after Martha's death was regathering, drawn back by circumstances none of them could have predicted. As darkness fell, Ranger rested his head on Mason's knee, eyes half closed in contentment. From the frail, tick-infested creature on the brink of death to the proud, healthy animal now helping others heal, his journey mirrored Mason's own. Both had been broken, both found at their lowest point, both transformed by the unexpected gift of a second chance. "We came a long way, didn't we, boy?" Mason murmured, his hand finding the spot behind Ranger's ears that always made the dog sigh with happiness. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, countless points of light illuminating a world that, for all its sorrows, still contained immeasurable possibilities for healing, connection, and love. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings arrive in our darkest moments. Mason Carter thought his days of purpose were behind him until he found Ranger, a dying German shepherd, covered in ticks, abandoned in a ditch. What began as an act of compassion transformed into a journey of mutual healing that awakened a community and mended a family fractured by time and distance. Through cardiac surgery, custody battles, and confronting painful truths, Mason discovered that it's never too late for second chances. His journey reminds us that even when our bodies begin to falter, our capacity to love and make a difference remains undiminished. Every one of us, regardless of age or circumstance, has something valuable to offer, whether to an abandoned animal, an estranged family member, or a neighbor in need. The walls we build in grief can become bridges of connection when we find the courage to open our hearts again. Has an unexpected encounter ever changed the direction of your life? What small act of kindness might you offer today that could ripple outward in ways you never imagined? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now.